Imagine being on the verge of a disaster, a situation that seems hopeless. That was the reality for Abigail, a wise and brave woman, who found herself standing between the anger of a future king and the foolishness of her own husband. But what made this woman so special? How did she, all by herself, manage to prevent a tragedy and change the course of Israel's history? Stay with me until the end, because Abigail's decision will surprise you and reveal a powerful lesson about wisdom, faith, and God's invisible hand at work in our lives. Abigail, whose story shines in 1 Samuel 25, is a remarkable example of wisdom and beauty, not just physical, but spiritual as well. Married to Nabal, a foolish and cruel man, she stands out for her noble character despite living a difficult life. The contrast between Abigail and Nabal couldn't be clearer. How could such a wise woman be married to such a fool? It's a question that makes us reflect on God's mysterious ways and the purpose of each relationship in our lives. With her wisdom, Abigail saw the danger long before anyone else. David, furious with Nabal's ingratitude, was about to take revenge. She understood that her husband's actions could lead to the death of many, including innocent people. Without wasting time, Abigail decided to intervene. What would you do if you were in her shoes? How would you react, knowing that your husband may have doomed your family to destruction? Her actions show not just a quick mind but also a heart set on peace. When she approached David with humility and gifts, Abigail bowed before him, acknowledging God's power in his life. She spoke words that calmed David's anger and made him reconsider his path. This woman, in her wisdom, prevented a tragedy. It makes us think, how many times are we called to intervene with wisdom in moments of tension? Are we ready to listen to God's voice and act with discernment? Abigail's actions also remind us how true beauty is tied to wisdom and the fear of the Lord. It wasn't just her appearance that made her stand out, but the way she reflected divine grace through her words and actions. Proverbs 31 verse 30 teaches us, "Charm is deceptive, and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised." Without a doubt, Abigail was one of those women who lived to honor God. Abigail's story challenges us to think about the impact of our daily decisions. She could have chosen to stay silent, but her courage and faith in God led her to save many lives. The question is, do we have the courage to follow Abigail's example, choosing wisdom and action even when the circumstances seem impossible? The conflict between David and Nabal was triggered by something that seemed simple at first but revealed a lot about the character of both men. David and his men had protected Nabal's shepherds in the desert, a gesture of kindness that deserved acknowledgement. Yet, Nabal, in his arrogance and hardness of heart, responded with contempt and refusal. How could someone be so ungrateful in the face of such generosity? This contrast reminds us of what Proverbs so often warns us about. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Proverbs 1 verse 5. Nabal's refusal to help not only offended David but also put his own family and servants at risk. David, a man used to battles and fights, reacted with the intent to seek vengeance, ready to destroy Nabal and all his men. At this point, we're reminded that even great men of God, like David, can be led by anger and the desire for retribution. Who hasn't felt betrayed or undervalued and wanted to act out of their own sense of justice? But as we'll see, the path of vengeance never leads to true peace. Nabal's behavior reflects a lack of discernment that reminds us of many biblical examples where foolishness led to destruction. In 1 Samuel 25 verse 25, Abigail describes her husband as a fool, and this title is no accident. The Bible teaches us that the mouths of fools are their undoing, Proverbs 18 verse 7, and Nabal, with his reckless words, put his household in danger, blinded by his pride. It makes us reflect on how often our own pride can lead us astray. As David prepares his men to attack, there's a tension in the air. Is the destruction of Nabal and his household really the right path? This is a crucial moment, where the desire for vengeance clashes with wisdom and patience. It makes us think, in how many situations in life, when we're ready to retaliate, should we stop and ask God what He wants us to do? Does our anger really justify what we're about to do? What happens next is the turning point of this story. Like many biblical passages, God raises someone to intervene, and in this case, it's Abigail, the wise and sensible wife. Without her intervention, the conflict between David and Nabal would have ended in tragedy. God often uses ordinary people to accomplish great things, and this episode teaches us that true victory often comes through wisdom, not strength. Abigail, seeing the seriousness of the situation, acted with a wisdom that goes beyond common sense. Instead of confronting Nabal directly, who had already shown his foolishness, she prepared a peace offering for David. It's interesting to note that while Nabal remained oblivious to the consequences of his actions, Abigail deeply understood the need for intervention. Here we see Proverbs 14 verse 1 in action. The wise woman builds her house, but with her own hands the foolish one tears hers down. Abigail is the true pillar holding up her family, even with a reckless husband. What makes Abigail's actions even more impressive is her courage. She goes out to meet David, a powerful and angry warrior, putting her own life at risk to save not just her household, but also her husband. How many times are we called to be like Abigail, to step into conflicts, even when it might cost us something? Her confidence wasn't just in the material offering she brought, but in her ability to discern what's right and what God desires. Abigail teaches us that true wisdom involves action, not just words. When Abigail meets David, she bows before him, showing humility and respect, but also an inner strength. Her words are carefully chosen to calm David's anger, and she appeals to the greater destiny that God has set for him. Abigail reminds David of his higher mission, telling him that he shouldn't stain his hands with unnecessary bloodshed. This makes us reflect, in moments of anger, who reminds us of our purpose. Who helps bring us back to the path of righteousness? Abigail's intervention is a reminder that God always puts people in our lives to guide us back to His will. David, upon hearing Abigail, immediately recognizes the wisdom in her words and thanks God for sending her. The power of a wise word at the right time is undeniable. How many times have we been about to make a mistake because of our emotions, and someone with discernment makes us pause and reflect? As Proverbs 15 verse 1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." Abigail embodies this truth, bringing peace where there was once hatred and conflict. In the end, Abigail not only saves her family but also prevents David from straying from God's path. Her story is a powerful example of how wisdom can change the course of events. It's no wonder that later, David takes her as his wife, recognizing the value of this woman of God. Abigail's intervention challenges us to be instruments of peace, to act with wisdom, and to seek God's will in all our decisions, even in the hardest of situations. Abigail's courage when she stands before David is one of the most striking moments in her story. Picture the scene: she's face to face with a man on the verge of unleashing bloody vengeance, driven by anger. David is not just a leader, he's a warrior with a strength and reputation that precedes him. Yet, Abigail, without fear for her own life, steps forward with humility and wisdom. It's amazing how she chooses her words so carefully, reflecting what Proverbs 16 verse 24 teaches: gracious words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. In her approach, Abigail not only pleads for David's mercy but also reminds him of God's bigger plan for his life. She wasn't just asking for her family, she was reminding David of his calling and his future as the king of Israel. How often, in the heat of emotion, do we forget our greater purpose? Abigail knew that by reminding David of God's will, she was planting a seed of reflection in his heart. Her courage came from a deep faith, and that faith sustained her as she made such a bold plea. What's also impressive is how Abigail balances courage with humility. Even though she's placing herself in great danger, there's no arrogance in her words. On the contrary, she speaks with respect, calling David, "my Lord," and herself, "your servant." This posture reflects a heart submitted to God's will, even in terrifying circumstances. Abigail wasn't trying to manipulate the situation, she was simply being faithful to her conviction that God is the true judge. As 1 Peter 3 verse 4 tells us, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit is of great worth in God's sight. By choosing to face David directly, Abigail demonstrates the essence of true courage. It's not the absence of fear but the willingness to do what's right, even when fear is present. In Scripture, courage is always tied to trust in God, not human strength. Let's remember Joshua 1 verse 9, where God says, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Abigail perfectly exemplifies this principle when she steps forward to meet David, with the conviction that God was guiding her actions. In the end, her courage not only saved lives but also helped keep David on the right path, away from the sin of vengeance. Abigail's actions were a reflection of her trust in God, teaching us that true courage isn't about never being afraid, but about choosing to follow God's will even in the face of the greatest challenges. Abigail's speech to David is one of the most powerful moments in her story, a true display of wisdom and humility. Her words are thoughtful, full of depth, and carry a deep reverence for God and the future He had planned for David. Abigail starts not just by asking for mercy for her household but by pointing to something greater, God's divine plan for David. She reminds him that he is chosen by God and that his life should be marked by justice and faithfulness, not vengeance. What's most impressive is how she blends human wisdom with divine revelation in her appeal. The central point of Abigail's speech is her acknowledgement of David's calling. She knew he would be the future king of Israel, and that his reputation as a just leader should not be tainted by unnecessary bloodshed. By speaking this way, Abigail wasn't just saving lives in the present, she was protecting David's legacy. In 1 Samuel 25 verses 30 to 31, she says, "When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself." This makes us reflect on how often we need people to help us see beyond our momentary emotions. Abigail appeals not only to David's mercy but also to his conscience. She points out that vengeance would have consequences not just in the physical realm, but in the spiritual one as well. As leaders and followers of Christ, we often face situations where our actions could damage our testimony. In her wisdom, Abigail was helping David remember that true strength isn't in the ability to retaliate but in the ability to forgive and trust God to bring justice. This reminds us of Romans 12 verse 19, where God says, "It is mine to avenge, I will repay." What's most impressive about Abigail's speech is how she brings God into the conversation. She doesn't try to justify Nabal's actions, but instead focuses on redirecting David toward God's will. Abigail is a clear example of what it means to be a peacemaker. In Matthew 5 verse 9, Jesus teaches us, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Abigail, with her wise and peaceful words, is living that out. She acknowledges the sin, but at the same time, offers a solution that reflects God's heart, mercy. In the end, Abigail's speech touches David's heart, and he recognizes God's hand through her. This moment reminds us that the right word at the right time has the power to change the course of a life, or even a nation. Abigail, with her deep appeal for mercy, teaches us that even in moments of tension and conflict, wisdom and trust in God can turn a situation of destruction into one of redemption. David, a man used to war and leadership, is deeply moved by Abigail's words. In the heat of his anger, he was ready to destroy Nabal's household, but Abigail's wisdom turned away his wrath and made him reflect. It's fascinating to see how one conversation can completely change the course of events. The Bible teaches us in Proverbs 15 verse 1 that, "A gentle answer turns away wrath," and Abigail is the perfect example of this truth. When David hears Abigail's calm and sensible voice, he realizes that God had sent her to keep him from straying off the path of righteousness. David's reaction is a reminder that even great leaders can be guided by the wisdom of others. He acknowledges that if he had followed through on his initial impulse, he would have made a mistake that could have damaged his reputation and his relationship with God. In 1 Samuel 25 verse 32, David says, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me." This shows us that God can use anyone, in any situation, to bring light and direction in a difficult moment. How often do we let pride blind us to the point of ignoring God's voice speaking through others? By accepting Abigail's gift and abandoning his plan for revenge, David demonstrates the importance of listening and learning. Even as a strong and courageous leader, he was able to recognize that Abigail's wisdom came from God. This is a great example for us today. How do we react when someone corrects or advises us? Do we have the humility to stop and listen, like David did? The Bible reminds us in Proverbs 19 verse 20, "Listen to advice and accept discipline, and at the end you will be counted among the wise. David did just that. What's also striking about this passage is how Abigail's wisdom not only turned away David's anger but also brought peace to a situation that seemed headed for tragedy. David acknowledges that without her intervention, he would have shed innocent blood. Once again, we see the importance of acting with discernment and patience before making impulsive decisions. As James 3 verse 17 teaches us, "But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit." And it was this kind of wisdom that Abigail brought to David's life in that moment. David's recognition of Abigail's role wasn't just an admission that she had saved him from making a mistake, it was also praise for how God works in our lives. Sometimes it's through subtle, unexpected interventions that God keeps us from walking down paths of destruction. David praised Abigail, but above all, he praised God for sending her as an instrument of peace and wisdom. This reminds us that even in the most tense moments, God always provides a way out, and often that way comes through wise, God-fearing people. Nabal's downfall is a clear example of how God's judgment is carried out against those who act with arrogance and wickedness. After learning what happened, the Bible tells us that Nabal's heart became like a stone, and he died 10 days later, 1 Samuel 25 verses 37 to 38. This is a direct act of judgment, reminding us that God sees and judges human actions. Nabal, who despised goodness and acted foolishly, was punished for his hard heart. It's impossible not to reflect here on the power of divine justice, which, even when not immediate, is always certain. Nabal is an example of what the Bible calls a foolish man. In Proverbs 10 verse 27, we read, "The fear of the Lord adds length to life, but the years of the wicked are cut short." Nabal's life was shortened by his lack of fear of God and his disdain for divine blessings. His death was not by David's hand but by God's, showing that no matter how much we try to take justice into our own hands, it's the Lord who ultimately judges. When we look at Nabal's life, we are reminded not to follow the path of foolishness and senselessness. God's judgment on Nabal also teaches us something about God's character. He is patient, but his justice is relentless. Nabal had prospered in life, but his heart was far from God. He refused to acknowledge the good that David and his men had done, and worse, he showed ingratitude and arrogance. This attitude is a direct contrast to what God expects from us. In Micah 6 verse 8, we are reminded, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." Nabal's death, as a direct result of his hardened heart, serves as a warning to all of us about the danger of living without repentance. His life could have been spared if he had shown humility and sought God's wisdom, like Abigail. Instead, he remained trapped in his pride, and his downfall was inevitable. This makes us reflect on how many times we ignore God's signs, hardening our own hearts. Are we ready to acknowledge our faults and turn to God before it's too late? Nabal's story reminds us that God's judgment is just and perfect. His death wasn't a coincidence but the execution of divine justice that cannot be escaped. While Abigail was used by God as an instrument of peace, Nabal faced the consequences of his choices. His downfall shows that those who resist God and despise His wisdom cannot escape His judgment. As Romans 2 verse 6 says, God will repay each person according to what they have done. After Nabal's death, Abigail's marriage to David marks a significant transformation in her life. Abigail, who had already proven herself to be a woman of great wisdom and discernment, now becomes one of the wives of one of Israel's greatest leaders. This marriage symbolizes not only the reward for her faithfulness to God but also the value of her virtues. David recognized qualities in Abigail that went far beyond physical beauty. He saw a woman guided by divine wisdom, someone who could walk by his side as both a spiritual and life partner. Abigail's marriage to David also represents a new chapter of elevation for her. Before, she was tied to a foolish and senseless man, but now she stands alongside a leader chosen by God. This contrast between Nabal and David highlights how God can turn difficult situations into unexpected blessings. By choosing Abigail as his wife, David not only honored her for her courage and wisdom, but he also recognized that God was working through her. Just as Proverbs 18 verse 22 says, "He who finds a wife finds what is good and receives favor from the Lord." Abigail's rise alongside David wasn't just about status, it was an opportunity for her to continue being a positive influence in her new husband's life. Abigail had already proven her worth by wisely interceding for Nabal, and now, by David's side, she would play an even more important role. As David's wife, she would be involved in decisions of great impact in critical moments in the life of the Kingdom of Israel. Abigail is a shining example of how, even in the face of challenges, God can elevate those who are faithful and wise. Moreover, Abigail's marriage to David shows how God rewards those who act with faith and integrity. Abigail didn't intervene between David and Nabal for her own benefit, she was focused on doing what was right in God's eyes. However, her selfless attitude brought unexpected blessings. How many times in our lives are we called to act in faith without knowing what will happen next? Abigail's story teaches us that God always honors those who trust in Him and act with wisdom. Abigail's rise as David's wife symbolizes God's grace and providence. Even when it seemed like her life would be marked by an unhappy marriage to Nabal, God had other plans. Abigail's journey reminds us that even in the most difficult situations, God can open doors to a new phase of life. By marrying David, Abigail not only rose in position but became part of a greater plan for Israel's history, showing that those who trust in God will always find a path to elevation and blessing. Abigail stands out in the Bible as one of the greatest symbols of peace and mediation. Her ability to intercede between David and Nabal in a moment of extreme tension reveals the power of wisdom and divine discernment. When everyone expected the conflict to result in bloodshed, Abigail, with her calmness and humility, brought about reconciliation. She is the perfect example of what Jesus taught us in Matthew 5 verse 9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." In the midst of chaos, Abigail brought the peace that no one else could. Abigail's role as a mediator wasn't just a momentary action but something that reflected her essence. Her intervention showed that instead of allowing both sides' emotions to escalate, she acted as a bridge, bringing wisdom to a place of conflict. Nabal, with his hardened heart, and David, with his justified anger, were disarmed by the intervention of a woman who understood the value of peace. As Proverbs 12 verse 20 teaches us, deceit is in the hearts of those who plot evil, but those who promote peace have joy. Abigail brought that joy by preventing an imminent tragedy. What makes Abigail even more remarkable is her ability to see beyond the immediate circumstances. She not only calmed David at that moment but pointed him toward a future of justice and peace that God had prepared for him. By reminding David of his destiny as the king of Israel, she shifted his focus from the present conflict to the greater purpose God had for him. This teaches us the importance of spiritual mediation, where instead of focusing on present offenses, we should remember God's promises for the future. Abigail is also a symbol of how the act of mediation can bring honor and respect. By confronting David, she gained not only his gratitude but also his recognition as a woman of God. She embodies what is written in James 3 verse 18, "Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." Her mediation wasn't a temporary fix but an example of how true peace has a lasting impact and brings divine justice. Finally, Abigail teaches us that mediation requires courage. She risked her own life to intercede between two powerful men, but she knew that peace was a value worth fighting for. In a world that often chooses conflict, Abigail chose to be an agent of reconciliation, showing that true strength lies in the ability to promote peace, even in the midst of adversity. She inspires us to be peacemakers in our own lives, trusting that just as God honored Abigail, He will also honor those who seek peace above all. Abigail's story invites us to deeply reflect on the role of faith, wisdom, and courage in our lives. In a moment of extreme crisis, Abigail not only trusted in God but acted with wisdom and discernment. Her faith wasn't passive, she knew she had to take action to prevent a looming disaster. How many times, when faced with difficult situations, do we hesitate to act, waiting for God to solve everything for us? Abigail reminds us that God also works through our actions when we move in faith and wisdom. Abigail's wisdom wasn't based solely on human knowledge but on her understanding of God's principles. By stepping between David and Nabal, she applied the wisdom of Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6, which instructs us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." Abigail recognized God's hand in David's life and was able to discern the right path, even in a moment of great tension. This teaches us that true wisdom comes from a deep intimacy with God and the ability to see beyond the immediate moment. Abigail's courage is another essential element of this story. She faced a powerful and enraged man, risking her own safety to save her family and many innocent lives. But her courage didn't come from reckless boldness, it was born from her trust in God. In Joshua 1 verse 9, God says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Abigail lived this truth, knowing that God was with her even in the face of danger, and this inspires us to act with courage in our own challenges. Abigail's faith, wisdom, and courage show us how God rewards those who act with integrity and trust in Him. She wasn't seeking recognition or rewards, but her faithfulness to God led her to a place of honor by David's side. The lesson here is clear: when we put God first and act according to His will, He transforms our circumstances, often beyond what we expect. As Romans 8 verse 28 reminds us, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Finally, Abigail's life challenges us to be peacemakers, even in the midst of chaos. Her wisdom and courage not only saved lives but also brought reconciliation and prevented bloodshed. As we reflect on this story, we must ask ourselves, are we willing to act with faith, wisdom, and courage in the crises of our own lives? Abigail shows us that when we put our trust in God and move with integrity, He can use us to accomplish great things, bringing peace and redemption where there was once conflict and destruction. Now that you've heard this powerful story of faith, wisdom, and courage, I want you to stop and reflect. How many times in your life have you wished for the courage of Abigail or the wisdom to make the right choice in a moment of crisis? If this story touched your heart and inspired you, don't let the message stop here. Like this video and show your support for content that brings the lessons of the Bible to life for today. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss any of these stories that have the power to transform lives, including yours. When you subscribe, you're joining a community of faith and learning, where together we grow in wisdom and understanding of God's Word. And even more, comment below, share your thoughts, your experiences, and what this story taught you. I want to hear from you. Your comments are crucial to continuing to bring deeper and more inspiring content. So, subscribe, like, and comment right now. Don't wait to be a part of this spiritual journey that's just beginning.